Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar, which is part of the Grooming and Coercive Control Summit 2023, hosted by Neurodiverse Connection. If you haven't heard of us before, Neurodiverse Connection is a community interest company that exists to elevate the voices of neurodivergent people to help them flourish and thrive. The Grooming and Coercive Control Summit is our first ever event series, so we are delighted that you've chosen to join us and be part of this. Our aim for the summit is to start conversations, collate knowledge, and share lived experiences of grooming and coercive control. This is an issue that affects many lives, but is rarely talked about openly. We believe that challenging the stigma that surrounds it can help to accelerate positive change in this critical area. Before we start today, there are just a few short housekeeping remarks. This webinar will be followed by a live Q&A session with our host, Rod Landman. At Neurodiverse Connection, we are committed to promoting the use of neurodivergent affirming language. Our guide to neurodivergent affirming language is available in the resource library section of our website. However, please note that in these webinars, as with any content that we host or share that has input from other organizations or parties, we cannot always guarantee that the preferred neurodivergent terminology is always used. And then finally, due to the very nature of the summit, there is, of course, a content warning for all of our webinars on grooming, abuse, and coercive control. Please find a link to a list of support organizations that we've compiled. This will be in the chat for this session. So on to this session. This webinar is delivered by Rod Landman. Rod has spent his whole life working in learning disability and autism services in many roles across many agencies, most recently for ARC England. His work has encompassed work on sexual health, mate crime, sexual exploitation, domestic abuse, sexual violence, extremism, radicalization, and online harm. He works alongside learning disabled and autistic colleagues in project work and training. ARC England is a national umbrella organisation for learning disability and autism providers. This webinar will address recent learning concerning online harms and threats centred on grooming, with a focus on autism and learning disabilities, drawing on project work involving experts by experience on mate crime, sexual exploitation, social media grooming for the purposes of radicalisation, and domestic abuse/sexual violence. Rod covers risk factors, the online world, learning disability and autism, grooming, case law, and key tools. This webinar will take an online positive approach, which argues that the internet is a fabulously positive thing in many lives. We're very excited to have Rod with us today. So without further ado, I will let this session start.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. Hi, everyone. The first thing I wanted to say is, I was saying to Tom before we started, I do have a tendency to gabble, especially when I'm nervous, which I'm because I'm in front of a lot of people today, but also because I'm up against the clock. If you find I'm talking too quickly, please just drop something in the chat box and get me to slow down. Right. So with no further ado, Tom's covered most of the introduction for me. So let's get interactive straight away. Some thoughts from you now, please, in the chat box. What do you love about your life online? Let's gather a few thoughts there. I'm not seeing anything. Don't be shy. There we go. So easy to, oh, now it's pouring in now. Easy to learn, quick, convenient. Easy way to connect with other people, convenient, accessing information, shopping. Yeah, we got there in the end. Escapism, lovely, less travel. Being nosy, you'd be amazed how much that one comes up. Sharing our lives, connecting with others, music, Amazon Prime. Yeah, that's great. Okay, quick response, connect with others. I'm going to stop the chat box there. That gives a really strong flavour, and I would say encompasses about the sort of your 5 or 6 most common things that we get every time I ask people that question. Whenever I'm working with people, whenever I'm training people about these issues, that's always my starting point. Because again, I was saying to Becca and Tom just before we started, our experience in the work that we've done in this area, mostly within learning disability services, but also some autism services, is that the first tendency towards dealing with concerning issues around online harms is about banning, about withdrawal of devices. And I think, so we like to contextualize that. that the internet, I was just saying, is actually a fabulously positive place for most people most of the time. And my argument would be, just sort of anecdotally through the work that I've done over the last few years with learning disabled and autistic people, is that that's particularly true for supported people in my experience. And we're going to be talking about quite a lot of really quite grim and unpleasant things over the next sort of 50 minutes or so. But I think it's important just to bear that in mind, that for most people, most of the time, the internet is a really positive place. And I think that's particularly true for supported people. Right, so, and let's get interactive again. Poll 1, I've got a couple of polls for you today. Here's the first one. Vote now. Which do you prefer? Your life online or the real world? People are voting in their droves as we speak. And it's really interesting results already. Okay, those numbers are starting to stabilize. Yeah, there's about 50 of you online at the moment. And every single one of you, we can end that poll now, every single one of you has said you prefer the real world, what we call the real world. The reason I raised that right at the beginning of the session as well is that I'm going to be talking to you about some of the project work, as Tom mentioned, particularly something called the Get Smart project. I'll make reference to that in a minute. That was the project that was concerned with the online radicalization of people with learning disabilities and autistic people. And that project ran in a very peer-led way. So we worked with young people with learning disabilities, young autistic people, got them to think about their lives online, invite in experts but speakers, chew the issues over, and then devise and deliver their own learning packages to their peers, but also to carers. And so we try to be as undirected as possible in that work. And that issue, this precise issue came up, which do you prefer? And what we found with the young people that we were working with was that every single one of them said the exact opposite of what you've just said. We worked with about 40 odd young people as part of that project, and every single one of those 40 young people said that they preferred their online life to the real world. And that flagged up obviously a couple of very significant issues for us, because when we then spoke to carers, and that was both informal and formal carers, so some staff but some family carers as well, they said what you've just said. So it flagged up this kind of enormous cultural gap that there is. We have to find a way of closing that gap. Otherwise, we're not going to be of much help and support to the people that we're working with. And that's all. I'll just go back up a slide just to introduce the next slide, again to give this a bit of context. The issues, I think many of the issues for that, for that outcome, people preferring the online world to what we were calling the real world, are flagged up in the quote that appears on the next slide, which was from one of the young people working on that project, one of the young autistic people. I'll let you read that yourselves. And I've seen that slide so many times over the last few years, and every time I see it, it still makes all of the hairs on my arms stand up. It's an incredibly powerful statement, and as I say, sums up many of the issues that we're going to be working through for the next hour. So this is what we are going to do. I think Tom's covered most of this already, so I can flick through this quite quickly. I'll give you a bit of background on what the range of online harms are. And what is it that places people at more significant risk of those harms? I'm going to drill down into grooming a bit, and I'll tell you why I'm going to focus on grooming a bit later, and then how to deal with it, what works, what do we know is successful in mitigating those online harms. So that's what we're going to cover. So I'll give you a bit of background. So that's talking about the project work I started to mention. I'm going to talk specifically about radicalization, learning disability, and autism. And the reason for that focus is because that was our way in to this work. But even though it's kind of the framing issue as far as we're concerned, it gave rise to all of the other issues that I'm going to be talking about today, and some of the stuff we're working with on an ongoing basis. So Get Smart was the project I cited earlier on. I'm then going to look at the other risks that we've come across. A very wide range there is too. And then I'm going to drill down into that issue of grooming and spend some time looking at that. Then, as I said, what does and doesn't work, the key tools that we have at our disposal for mitigating the harms, and a bit about, what next? Where do we go from here? Right, so the background. So this is all the project work. As Tom said earlier on, I've been working in projects for more than 10 years now that have been focused on various aspects of criminality as they affect people with learning disabilities and autistic people, and in an increasingly kind of user or peer or expert by experience led way. So it goes all the way back to the issue of mate crime. More than 10 years ago, we set up a project called Safety Net, which is the first project in the country looking at the issue of mate crime. If you're not aware of mate crimes, I'll touch on that very briefly. Mate crimes are what happen when people with learning disabilities or autistic people who are living independently or semi-independently get befriended. And then that friendship is used for the exploitation or abuse of the person with a learning disability or autism. We started looking for money for that project work following the murder of a guy called Stephen Hoskin in Cornwall in 2006. Stephen was befriended by a group of young people who entered into an extremely damaging relationship with him, during which there was a protracted period of what could only be called torture, culminating in an appallingly brutal murder. When I started looking back on previous murders of people with learning disabilities in particular, I identified about another dozen murders that had taken place in very similar circumstances to Stephen. And they continue to happen now. I keep my eyes open, and I would say an average of kind of 1 or 2 a year every year. I see people being killed in a very similar sort of fashion. Now, the Safety Net project, it's more than 10 years ago now, and the transformation, I think, in the adoption of IT by supported people really occurred during that project. So at the beginning of Safety Net, we had evidence that only about 25% of people with learning disabilities even had access to a computer. And typically that was even kind of a terminal, a dead-end computer. They couldn't get online. That was just access to any kind of IT whatsoever. It started to change during the Safety Net project, and was then that whole process was obviously greatly exaggerated by COVID, the lockdowns and COVID. And I would say we're in a position now where vast majority, well into the upper 90% of supported people have at least a smartphone. And therefore, whether they realise it or not, and whether their carers realise it or not, and they frequently don't, it means that people are online 24/7 through those devices. So a world that's really transformed. But our awareness of the issues that we're going to be dealing with today did start towards the back end of the Safety Net project. I remember being contacted by a disability organisation, learning disability organisation in Bristol, who was supporting a young woman with learning disabilities who was an early adopter of IT, loved Facebook and other social media, and was befriended on Facebook by someone who then ran what we would now think of as a very typical romance scam on her. So he spent some months developing a relationship with her, deepening that relationship. And then after a few months, told her that he'd fallen in love with her. What they should do is get together and get married, move in together, have children. The rest of their lives would be absolutely wonderful. He was a bit short on money right now, and he could use some money to help fund his divorce from his wife, who's being difficult as she could possibly just find a way of sending him 50 quid. So she did. And then she sent him another 50, and then she sent him 100, and then she sent him 200. And the only reason the staff found out that this was going on was because somebody walked into her bedroom one evening and found her undressing for this man in front of her webcam. And that said a couple of things to us. The first, it was we regarded that as a kind of an archetypical mate crime, in that it involved the two predominant forms of mate crime, and certainly as they affect people with learning disabilities, which are financial exploitation and sexual exploitation, very often with a link between the two. So you get some boundary testing with financial exploitation. If people get away with it, they'll move on to sexual exploitation. The other reason it was archetypical was because, typically speaking, if mate crimes are not interrupted, they tend to get worse. It's a downward spiral. But the other things that then really bothered us about it was that, what occurred to me was that when I was, so I spent my entire life working in learning disability and autism services. So when I started working for the National Autistic Society, when I left school all of those decades ago, you had to be in the same room as somebody to abuse them. And now what occurred to us was that not just that you could abuse somebody from the other side of the planet, it's actually in your interest to do so because you're never going to get nicked. And then the other thing that occurred to me about it was that, again, when I was growing up in North Kent working for the National Autistic Society, there might have been half a dozen people in that local community who would consider abusing somebody with a learning disability or an autistic person in that way. But now people are suddenly open to literally tens of thousands of potential abusers right the way around the planet who are engaged in this kind of phishing with a PH activity the entire time. So, the potential there was kind of obvious right the way back to the safety net days. So that led on to, then did 5 years worth of work on sexual exploitation, partly through ARC, but also partly through the British Institute of Learning Disabilities, or BUILD. And again, the world that we're in now, I would argue that comfortably more than half of sexual exploitation has an online element to it, is either perpetrated online or has some other online manifestation. We then got going on the Get Smart project, which is the one that was funded. The logo's at the bottom of the screen. That was funded by Google, and we worked with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue on that project. So that was the one about, say, social media grooming of people with learning disabilities and autistic people, for the purposes of extremism and radicalisation. And then finally, us too. So the work I've been doing over the last 3 years has been supporting a group of women with learning disabilities, and autistic women, all of whom have experienced domestic abuse or sexual violence, or both. And I've been supporting that team of women to draw on their experiences to devise and deliver training to their peers, to social care professionals, and working with domestic abuse and sexual violence services and access issues as well. And again, certainly one of the things that we've had even through that work on domestic abuse is that there are strong online elements to the way in which domestic abuse is perpetrated now through things such as revenge porn. So all of that work over the last 10 plus years, we've seen this kind of aspect of online harms running through that like letters through a stick of rock. So that's the background, and a whole host of cases. Some headlines that we kind of pulled off the internet there, sort of flagging the kind of the real world issues that this has given rise to, and there's a whole host of examples that we can point to in which, say again, young people, typically autistic young people, typically young people with learning disabilities who have been groomed online, and then persuaded, and a number of these people got to the point of actually building viable devices and even attempting to plant them. I think it's pure good luck by which nobody has been harmed apart from one of the potential bombers, Nikki Riley, in the far left picture there. So it's kind of strong background, and the threat, I think, is really obvious. A little bit more interactivity here. A second poll for you. So, question for you. So, Prevent. If you're not aware of Prevent is the government's anti-radicalisation strategy. There's an element of that called Channel, in which people can be referred to Channel. If people have got concerns that people are being radicalised, they can refer people to Channel. So a question for you there, which is, do you think that autistic people with learning disabilities, are more likely to be referred to Channel/Prevent than the general population? Less likely, or about average for the population? A number of you are voting now. Okay, so we've hit 50, going over 50. Again, really interesting results. Can we share those with people, Becca? Just so people can see what they've done. Yeah.
I'm not.
No, okay, if you can't, that's fine. I'll just read that out. Just over half of you said more likely to be referred. Just over a third of you said less likely to be referred to Prevent. And about 10% of you said about average for the population. So I'm going to end that and get rid of that. So most of you were right. It is, sorry, I'm having trouble getting rid of the polls off my screen now. There we go. Okay. Most of you are right. Yeah, more likely to be referred is the answer to that one. The reason we started looking for the money for the Get Smart project was because I had a conversation with the community safety officer in Devon, who told me that in Devon, where I now live and mostly work, about 75% of the young people being referred to Channel had learning disabilities or were autistic. It is a figure I have heard replicated elsewhere in the country. While there is no research evidence that I can point you to, it does feel as though that's probably a fairly widely acknowledged national picture. So far more likely to be referred to prevent. So why is that is the question that I'm now going to move on to. And what I'm going to be doing odd times today is sharing information. Normally when I deliver this, I'm feeling rather lonely today because the vast majority of the time now when I am delivering training around online harms, I have a team of young people with learning disabilities and young autistic people who co-deliver the training with me. And I interview them about their experiences and their knowledge, which is far broader than mine, in all honesty. As part of that training, and what I'm going to be that they were unable to be here today, but what I am going to do is share with you some of their insights. So that's what's going to be happening right now. So this is what various team members have said about that. Why are you much more likely to be referred to Channel if you've got a learning disability or autism? So here's some things that people have said. So Steph talked about. She said, "You believe what you read. You take people at face values." And Steph's autistic. Haven't had the education. They're in the background, and people want friends. If you don't have thousands of followers, you're nothing, she said. We want to please people. And she also said that tone can be very difficult to read for autistic people. And then Stefan talked about people's loneliness, and very often people are living in very socially isolated circumstances. People's loneliness is easily exploited. He says, groomers are always 5 steps ahead of you, he said. And people are easily manipulated, especially online. With Stefan's insight, he said that, unlike in the real world, he said to me, I can see dangers in the real world. I can't see them online, he said. And then James was talking about, he said, it's just too easy to end up in bad places, just a few clicks away. And people want to be cool. They want to be liked. It's why they get engaged in this. And therefore, people are more likely to take risks, is what James said to me. So that's what various team members have said. And then going back to the Get Smart project, say working with young people as part of that, these are the sorts of things that they've said. So they all said, as I mentioned earlier on our first poll, their life is better online. They all said that. And these are the reasons they gave for that. So they said things like, you can do things online that you can't do in real life. You can be someone different. And that is really significant. One of the really powerful things that we've picked up anecdotally over the last few years is that, say, the young learning disabled people, the young autistic people that we've worked with have said to us consistently, online is a place I don't have to be disabled. And again, you can understand the power of that kind of experience. So you can be someone different. You can have whatever you want, unlike in real life. A gaming group can become like your family, we were told. And if I go outside, it's a fairly universal experiences. If I go outside, I'm bullied. People have a horrible time in the kind of the physical, immediate community. They feel threatened. They feel scared. They actually feel, perversely, in some ways, safer online. So some of the conclusions that we drew from the conversations we had with those young people were, first of all, emotions are felt more intensely. So if people felt angry in real life, they felt even angrier online. And this is largely through gaming experiences, but also things like chat rooms as well. If they liked people in the real world, they felt love, passion online. Emotions were exaggerated. And actually, Steph shared with me an insight quite recently. She said that it's not just that they kind of were exaggerated. She's there. It's actually encouraged. That actually those expressions of intense emotions are actually encouraged in the gaming communities. So that in turn leads to an altered moral paradigm. So yeah, this is a fairly mild example that we had here. Yes, this is one of the school children that we worked with. Obviously, swearing's a little bit kind of a little bit naughty. You can do things online you can't do in real life, like swearing. But again, if your boundaries are shifted for that one thing, again, you can see how they're kind of lowered for other forms of previously regarded illicit activity. So yeah, the same rules don't apply, and especially if we've got that thing about people inhabiting a different identity online. So again, frequently in the gaming communities, people do have avatars. They are kind of literally somebody different online, and that means that the rules that you have for yourself in your lived identity do not apply when you're in that online identity. And again, going back to the bullying thing, people again, largely ignored by local communities. We research evidence suggests that for people with learning disabilities, only about 1 in 5 people with learning disabilities have someone in their lives who is not paid to be with them or not family. Very, very few people have kind of friendships. And so that again, that connection with the immediate physical lived world is diminished. Particularly because, as I said a minute ago, they are bullied, exploited, harassed in the immediate lived. Sorry, the polls keep coming back onto my screen. Try and get rid of it that way. There we go. So yeah, persecution common. But I think an interesting question also is to say, so we would detect all kinds of situational vulnerabilities for people with learning disabilities and autistic people. But people have also frequently said to me, are people actually more at risk online, or is it just that they're more likely to be spotted? Is kind of dodgy online behavior actually just more likely to be picked up by people because people have support networks around them? Is it there are just more sets of eyes on, which means that sort of activity, I say, is more likely to be detected? And I can see that as an issue, and that might be an aspect of it. But as I said earlier on, there's very little actual research around this that you can point to and say, yeah, look, there's the risk. But one of the few bits that we do know is that where grooming does take place, the figures that we have is that if you have a learning disability, if you are autistic, then your grooming risk roughly doubles online. And I'd also argue, certainly we know from the learning disability world that only about 15% of people with learning disabilities these days have anything in the way of specialist health or social care support. The vast majority of people do not have those protective networks around them. So I would argue that there still clearly is a greatly enhanced risk for people with learning disabilities and autistic people. And then in terms of, say, a lot of the people we worked with on Get Smart did have autism. And again, these are some of the quotes that we had from those young people that we worked with. They said, we find it harder to make friends, so we're more likely to settle for any kind of relationship. But we can find a community online. And of course, that's one of the great and positive things about the online experience that I was drawing attention to right at the beginning of the session. People with autism like following rules. Was said to me, and actually I'll come back to that quote in a minute. We don't see. Oh, sorry, there's a word missing here. We don't see why people would lie to us. Sorry, it is there. We don't see why people would lie to us. And I had a recent conversation with a colleague in Arc, Scotland, because I do some work north of the border as well with perpetrators. And one of the things that people said to us there, we had an interchange again with a young autistic person recently who said that he got in trouble because through using illegal porn online, and his understanding was if it was online, it couldn't be illegal. He had this great adherence to the rules essentially, and his perception was very much if it was illegal, it couldn't possibly be there, and that's what had led him into problems. So this next slide is that there's various ways of analysing the various risks that people are subject to. The 3 C's is the most commonly used one. You might sometimes see the 4 C's as well. They say pretty much the same sort of thing. It's just a question of how you kind of group them or define them. I'm not going to take you through this table, but it's quite a useful way, I think, of breaking down those risks. Doesn't cover all of them, I think. You know, we've come across a number of examples recently about things like internet challenges that have led to problems for people, people being encouraged into self-harm, or even suicide attempts, through being goaded or again groomed, coerced online. And then the most recent issue that's been occupying a lot of my time has been around something called OCAGs. If you're not familiar with OCAGs are online child abuse activist groups. So essentially kind of they self-style themselves as online vigilantes. So set up fake profiles as a way of entrapping people with learning disabilities supposedly into relationships with underage children, and then tend to stage physical meetings, in-person meetings. They film and upload all the content online. We are now in a position where we believe, and there's a lot of work still to be done on this, but if people want to get in touch with me, if you've got experiences you want to share, then I'm very happy to hear from people after today. But we believe that actually most people, most men being entrapped by OCAGs actually have learning disabilities or are autistic. And the vast majority of them actually have no interest in paedophilia whatsoever. They have just missed the signals that can sometimes be quite subtle from these online vigilantes. And we think an awful lot of miscarriages of justice are taking place as a result of that activity. And say there's a number of things that I'm doing at the moment to drill down into that aspect and see if our anecdotal evidence is borne out by what we know to be true. So do get in touch if that's of interest to you and if you've got experiences that you wanted to share. So a whole host of activities, but basically, so just going back to that slide a second, the reason that I then sort of focus on grooming is because, again, I mentioned sort of letters through a stick of rock earlier on. I would say the same is true for that grooming is the central feature of most of the online harms, most of that activity that we have come across and we've been working with over the last few years. Hence that focused kind of, no matter what label you give it, grooming lies at the heart of it. So a little bit of knowledge for you here. Now, these risk factors, actually, I'll just flick them all up. Sorry, going too quickly. These risk factors were given to us. I said earlier on, we ran the Get Smart project with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And this was the list that they gave us on risk factors for grooming. Now, this was specifically in relation to extremism and radicalization. We see echoes again of this right the way through all the work that we've done. And I think if you run your eye down that left-hand list, loneliness, I mentioned earlier on, we know that a great many of supported people live in circumstances of social isolation. Very few have people in their lives who are not paid to be with them or are not family members. We know that there is an awful lot of kind of learnt social naivety on the part of supported people when it comes to trusting, boredom. Again, we know that huge quantities, for example, of daytime opportunities have been shut down for people over the last few years in the age of austerity. People, as a fact, have much less to do. There is a need to belong. I said earlier on, very often in people's lived physical communities, they don't get that, but they find communities online. When it comes to abuse, we know that people with learning disabilities experience sexual abuse at roughly double the rate of the general population. Sexual exploitation at roughly 3 times the rate of the general population. Domestic abuse that I'm working at the moment at roughly 3 times the rate of the general population. We also know that people with learning disabilities and autistic people have enhanced mental health issues, mental health challenges, that vast numbers of people with learning disabilities, vast numbers of autistic people also experience poor mental ill health. And then the joblessness as well. The joblessness figures, both for learning disabled and autistic people, suggest that fewer than 10% of people have anything in the way of a job at all, and most of those jobs are part-time. So all of those risk factors, you can start to see why there's such an issue when when I talk about, say, situational vulnerabilities for people with learning disabilities and autistic people. And then if you run your eye down that right-hand column, again, you can pretty much tick those off. They describe the life experience of so many supported people. including things like the gang involvement. By the way, one of the big things that we came up on the work that we did on Mate Crime was, again, the numbers of people with learning disabilities who get caught up in county lines, for example. And again, always in trouble with the police, people with learning disabilities, vastly overrepresented in the prison system, the whole of the criminal justice sector. So so those are the risk factors, and again, I think you can see where the issues are coming from. And this is how grooming works. And again, we started this off again specifically in relation to radicalization, extremism. But again, this works in every sphere. We would recognize this from all of the other work that we've done as well. The process is happening roughly the same way, no matter what the framing context might be. So groomers start to cut people off from their existing sources of support. Gifts, money, or just being made to feel special. There's something there in a way. This is about a carrot rather than a stick. It's about creating strong emotions, channeling those emotions, using them against you, setting up a binary worldview, us against the world. Gives people that enhanced sense of belonging, creates that pretend family unit, as I was mentioning on a previous slide. So creates a group. Oh, there we go. Just to underline that one. Creates a group where all you need to be met, a pretend family unit. That's how it works. So kind of no matter what the context. You might be aware that earlier on this year, the report was published on the Manchester Arena bombing. That happened a few years ago now, and that analysed how the person who perpetrated that particular atrocity had been groomed, and it worked in exactly the same way. There's nothing new here at all. And a few indicators for you. How can you tell that grooming is taking place? So you're looking at things like increasing internet use, secretive internet use, people using multiple devices. Conversations with suspected individuals who are groomers, they will quite quickly move from a kind of a mainstream app or platform like Facebook onto other platforms, other apps that are less monitored. You might get a sudden change in interest from the individual, a desensitization, as people getting used to horrible things, basically. And then in terms of the perpetrator, a reluctance to appear on camera or to meet the individual in person. And then again, in terms of the victim of grooming, people again cutting themselves off from their normal social groups, their normal sources of support. Right, going to turn back to the experts by experience who I work with, my colleagues with learning disabilities, my colleagues with autism. When they've discussed, again, their experiences, their insights into how we can reduce the risk. And this is what a couple of team members have said to me. They said things like, Steph talked about education for people. People have not had this education. And she said, keep it really specific, real examples. She said, have practical steps. So things like, what grooming looks like at each stage, what the groomer will say, how you should respond to that. And keep educating. Once is never going to be enough. And simple rules applied by all. And that's the thing that I'll come back to, because all of our anecdotal evidence about what actually works comes back to that sort of issue again and again and again, having simple rules that are applied consistently by everybody in a person's support network. And then Stefan's talked about, supporting people to control what is controllable, and not all of this stuff is. I'll come back to that later on. And he said, using social stories, whatever, again, kind of real examples, and having simple, accessible reporting mechanisms for people. And then James most recently talked about, he said to me about things like needing people you can talk to, people you can trust, people who won't panic when you tell them what's going on, people who won't ban you from devices. That's something I'll come back to later on. And James talked about the importance of peer support wherever possible. Okay, so here's another question for you, but an open question. So even if it was ethical, does prohibition work? And as I said earlier on, the reason I ask this question is because our experience in working with social care services is that very often their solution to their concerns is to ban and to withdraw devices, stop people from using the online world, and to take mobile phones away from them. It's been a very typical service response. It doesn't work. It never has worked. It never will do. There's some interesting figures about the United States war on drugs, which was begun by Ronald Reagan all of those decades ago in 1981. And since 1981, the United States has spent $150 billion on the war against drugs. And in that time, 1.1 million of its citizens have died from overdoses. It doesn't work. And in fact, not only does it not work, it tends to be counterproductive. What it tends to lead to is secretive internet use. People will always find a way. Becca said to me before we started today, where there's a will, there's a way. And yeah, utterly, yeah, people will find ways. They will find other devices. All it means is that next time that they'll do it, they're less likely to tell you. And therefore, whatever they're doing is actually going to carry in an enhanced danger with it. So it doesn't work anyway. And even if it did, it is not ethical. And most of the time, it's actually not even legal. And I'll come back to that when I talk about the Mental Capacity Act shortly. So does it work? No is the answer to that one. Banning and withdrawing is not the response. But we do have some tools that we can use, and I'll do a quick rush through these now. So it's about, as far as I'm concerned, it's about applying the key principles of the Mental Capacity Act, thinking about deprivations of liberty and the safeguards that we've got there. I'm going to talk you through some stuff about capacity and extremely unwise decision making, and then it's about positive risk approaches, the world that we're in now, about risk enablement rather than kind of risk assessment, not regarding risk as a reason for not doing something, but trying to find ways of just making sure that people can do what they want to do, but as safely as possible, and about applying the key principles that came from the safeguarding aspects of the CARE Act. So I'll talk you through those quickly now. So yeah, the Mental Capacity Act, key principles of the Mental Capacity Act. Our starting point, the first key principle, an assumption of capacity. And we do have to bear that in mind. If we think that people lack capacity, that's what the Mental Capacity Act is about. It's not about having to prove capacity. It's about having to prove incapacity if you think that is the case. So bearing in mind what I've put there, that, that we do not, just because somebody is making an unwise decision, that does not mean that they lack capacity. I'll come back to unwise decisions in a bit. And it's about really applying the second key principle of the Mental Capacity Act. What do we need to do? What can we put in place so that people can come to their own decisions, can stay in control of their own lives? Third key principle is that if people have capacity, they are entitled to make unwise decisions. And the really key point here, we are not the morality of police. Just because we might find something distasteful, if it's beyond our experience, if it's something that we wouldn't do, that doesn't make it wrong. We may not be enthusiasts about pornography, for example, but we have to recognize that that's a very normal life for most people these days. Over 50% of the UK population uses pornography in an online world. And the same thing with sexting. Across all age groups, all sectors of society, sexting is a part of most people's sex lives these days. But it might not be part of our repertoire, but unfortunately that does not make it wrong. We're not the morality police. Fourth key principle is that if people lack capacity, their job is to act in their best interests, and I'll come back to that when I talk about doles in just a second. And the fifth key principle is that when we are applying the principle of best interest, we have to use the least restrictive option. That rarely, if ever, means banning and prohibition. So online, what I'm going to talk about now, this next slide is a kind of a standard of practices that emerged from case law from the Court of Protection over the last 4 years, when they started looking at some really contentious cases about people's use of devices online world, and then things like extreme pornography online. And an understanding has started to emerge about the relevant factors. If you're familiar with the Mental Capacity Act, you will be aware that it talks about relevant information to be considered when we are making decisions about people's capacity for a particular action at a particular time. So these are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about when we're assessing people's capacity. Do people understand that what they post online, what they put online, can then be shared widely, and you do not have to give your consent to that? Have people got an understanding that devices have privacy and location settings and that they can be used? It doesn't mean to say that they have to use them, but they do have to be aware that they are there, and and they are an option. Do people have an understanding that things that they do or say online can upset or offend other people? Do they have an understanding that people online may not be who they say they are, and frequently are not? And do they have an understanding that people they meet online can pose a risk to them in the real world, and that some things that they do online can be illegal, unlike the young autistic man I was talking about earlier on, who believed that, just because it's online it must be lawful. Okay, so that's the relevant information that's now been identified by the Court of Protection. When you get these slides from me, I'm assuming these are being shared after today. I'm very happy for them to be so. Then that should be a hyperlink where it says Court of Protection 2019. So that'll take you through to those Court of Protection judgments. Now, a few notes about that relevant information. So first of all, essentially, it's not a pass or fail test. So we go back to that. If you tick all of those boxes, you can use the internet safely online independently. And if you've got crosses against any of them, you can't. It's not that simple. It's not a pass or fail or test. And I think an interesting question to ask ourselves is, if it was, would we pass? And a good number of us, I suspect, would not. It is guidance. It's not rules. It's a starting point to make a decision. So it's considerations, so absolutely not the be all and end all. And do bear that in mind. And then deprivations of liberty. So just a few reminders. If we get to the point of deeming that somebody lacks capacity, then we're in the world of applying the key principles of deprivations of liberty. So we can only deprive somebody of their liberty if they lack capacity. And even though we have deemed they lack capacity, we still need to take into account people's views. They also have insights into how that deprivation should be applied. They may not get what they want, but their views are a really important part of the picture. And again, some reminders for you. We can only deprive somebody of the liberty if it is in their best interests and it is a reaction to a particular harm. It is a proportionate response to that harm, both in terms of its likelihood and seriousness, and if there's no less restrictive alternative. As I said, so the starting point is not prohibition and banning. It can still be, you might still get to that point, but that needs to be a good way down the line. There are still examples where the Court of Protection has imposed those restrictions on people, but I say it's very much the end point, not the start point. So yeah, we're really in a world, as I said earlier on, we've moved a very, very long way away from seeing risk as a reason to stop people from doing things. We are in a world of positive risk management, risk enablement, in which risk is seen as a really crucial part of people's lives. As it says, they're completely inevitable. A life without risk is impossible and would actually be awful. If you take a second to think about what your own life would be like without risk, I don't think it's a life that any of us would recognize. So the idea of kind of removing that kind of that normal life experience for people it should be fairly abhorrent, I think, to all of us. Removing those opportunities for learning experiences that come from taking risks. Again, it's a strange concept. So yeah, in a world in which self-determined anti-oppressive practice should be our guiding principles. So it's about let's try and empathize. Let's see the world through the people through the eyes of people that we are supporting. Now, a few notes here about very unwise decision making. So it's an abiding issue, concern for services. If we are looking at people who are working with supporting people who are making extremely unwise decisions, and by that I mean people who are choosing very dangerous relationships, very dangerous situations where everybody around the individual can see that they pose a risk, a very significant risk to the person's well-being or even life. So if I think about some of the hate crime murders that I've worked with, if I think about some of the work I've done on domestic abuse and sexual violence over the last 2 years, people appearing to choose, say, very, very dangerous relationships. So what do we do if we deem that somebody has capacity, but they're still making very unwise decisions? I'm just going to do a pointer here on executive dysfunction, because if I get into talking about executive dysfunction now, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. We will not come out this side of 1:30. So I'm going to say to you that one of the other things I can make available for you today is a couple of really good links to reading more about executive dysfunction. It's again something that's emerged in case law from the Court of Protection over the last 4 years. And what it essentially says is, as well as being able to talk the talk, people need to be able to walk the walk. So in other words, as well as being able to kind of make the decision that they are making, they then need to be able to kind of follow through and deliver on that decision. And I think that there are some very significant challenges to mental capacity law that come from that. So have a think about whether the person might be experiencing executive dysfunction. As I said, I'll make sure you get some links to that and more reading about that after today. But if we've excluded that, then it's about sitting down again, say alongside the individual, taking that empathic approach, supporting the person to look at what's going on, but to make sure that they've got very clear vision on that. So getting people to kind of sign off on the level of risks that they're taking, the possible outcomes from the relationship that they're in, the course of action that they are choosing. So really getting to agree on that, and kind of I would actually say to the point of kind of literally getting to sign off on the level of risks that they're taking. But also offering people alternatives. It might be, or sometimes people are reluctant to accept the help and advice of people who provide services, I think for very understandable reasons, because that kind of power relationship, that power dynamic that undoubtedly exists, whether we're prepared to accept that or not, it does. So are people more likely to accept the help, advice, support as somebody who they regard as being external to services, or somebody who they regard as being a peer, where that power relationship does not exist? And in the meantime, I think there's always a rush towards thinking about very kind of practical solutions around this stuff, the practical, tangible, lived world experiences, which is why there is this rush to kind of banning and withdrawal in our experience. And we tend to rush right past the stuff actually that we're very, very good at in social care, is the argument I always make when I'm working with social care services. We are good at this stuff about supporting people's confidence and self-esteem. An awful lot of the time that people have ended up in abusive relationships, in my experience, is partly because they think that's the only relationship they're going to get. And it's a hard thing to have to say. But people really do say that, and a better an abusive relationship than no relationship at all, I have heard on a number of occasions. And also painfully, to an extent, on a number of occasions, I've also heard people say that they think that that's kind of all that they're worth, and actually all that they kind of deserve. And they're horrible things to have to entertain, but we have to recognise that that is how some people see their lives, because of the way in which they've been socialised, the way in which people have treated people with learning disabilities, autistic people, for many, many years now. It's hardly surprising that people do experience very, very poor self-esteem. So there is something here about, you say, that stuff we're good at in social care, about enhancing people's confidence, so that people are able to escape those relationships and those situations, and enhancing their self-esteem so that they know they are actually worth more than that. And agreeing an escape plan with the individual as well. They're commonly used devices by domestic abuse services. Again, one of the things that we know about domestically abusive relationships is that the most dangerous time in those relationships is when you're planning on leaving them. So you have to have a number of things in place at that point. So it's things like having burner phones, untraceable credit or debit cards, the phone numbers of people you need to be in touch with, things like having your birth certificate, your national insurance number, having cash, having places you can go. There's a number of things that you need to think about. We did, as part of the Us2 project, devise an easy read, or an easier read escape plan. It's there on our website, like all of the resources that we produce from our projects are all available free of charge to download, adapt and use. all there on the ARC website, and do have a look. Say this escape plan is that if you can't find it, let me know and I can send you a direct link for it. It was very much a kind of, an early attempt at an accessible escape plan. Could, I'm sure, be better. But we think has wider applicability than just domestic abuse and sexual violence. There's a whole host, I think, of these very dangerous situations, very dangerous relationships that people get into, where an escape plan could be a useful tool. And then, yeah, supporting the person as much as possible to take control of their own lives. A few more notes for you here. Yeah, so again, making sure that you're covering yourself as well. We just have to. So think about, you may have very good reasons for not intervening in that situation or that relationship. If you do, great, write them down. You may have very good reasons, and there are some, for not sharing information with partner agencies. But again, if you have got those reasons, make sure you record them. Record your specific assessment of their capacity for that specific decision at that specific time, and any conversations you have with people. And I always recommend that that's done verbatim and contemporaneously, if possible. If not, then as soon as possible afterwards. Make sure you review the situation regularly. I am filled with despair how often I have read domestic homicide reviews and serious case reviews about the murders of people with learning disability, where really good risk enablement work has been done that's then not been followed through. I'm sorry, I've just had a look at my clock and I realised how late I'm running, so I'm just going to rush through the next few slides. And I said already about this, building trust with individuals. They do feel able to come to you when they are ready to escape that situation or that relationship. And again, so doing other stuff that we're very good in social care about, encouraging healthy relationships, so people do have other options. There are the 6 key principles of safeguarding you'll be very familiar with. And in terms of what work, it's about applying those key principles of safeguarding. Here are the things we know work from our experiences, from our reading, from the little bits and pieces of academic work that have been done. Prohibition doesn't. I've already covered why that is the case. And I think a very good quote here from an academic colleague of mine, which is, what we're talking about here is a non-physical world. You cannot control the non-physical world in the physical world. There is always, as we said earlier on, people find a way. It's all about creating conditions that make disclosure more likely. And that's just about having, communicating with people, having those open conversations with people, really listening to what people are saying to you and taking that seriously. A few other things that work, having a no blame policy. So again, if we get hysterical when things are going wrong with people, when people have done something wrong, they've got themselves into trouble. And similarly with staff, if they fail to support people in an effective, positive way, and people come to us and all we do is bite their heads off, it just means that people are less likely to come to us next time. So no blame policy. I say education for everyone. That's obviously mostly about supported people that I'm talking about. That absolutely for the staff who are supporting them as well. Said earlier on, our experience in Get Smart was that there was that massive gap between supported people and their use of the online world and that in the people who were supporting them. We need to close that gap. We need to do a little bit of self-analysis in terms of what our taboos are. As I said earlier on, we're not the morality police. Where are our buttons that we have to be aware of? What are the limits of our knowledge and how can we close that gap? Accessible routes for reporting works. Function analysis. What are people getting out of their online activity? Are there healthier, safer, more positive ways of meeting those same needs? Joint risk assessment and enablements, that's sitting down with the individual, looking at the world from their perspective, seeing it from their perspective and getting their solutions to their problems. Joint policy work as well, and as I say, with the individual, but also ideally, I think, with people's families wherever possible, and obviously with their consent. A Get Smart project, very happy to provide people with advice on that. And sometimes this is a very complicated, a very fast moving world. It might be that sometimes you do need to seek that external expert advice and support. And again, just a quote from a couple of my academic friends here about what works. And they said, there's a tendency again to look at those kind of educational resources, and that is important. But they have always said, what's far more important is consistent, simple messages consistently applied across all stakeholders, across people's entire support networks. Again, when you get this, get or have access to this presentation after today, this will all be hyperlinked. So there's a number of resources that we've got up on our website, and a full version of this training that I've kind of rushed through in the last hour with you. We do sort of half-day workshop, say alongside, say, colleagues with lived experience, my learning disabled and autistic colleagues, and all those other bits and pieces as well. A little quote there again, just from somebody else who's involved in the Get Smart project and what he said, and I think also thought it was a fabulous insight. Life online is better, but you still have to learn how to deal with the real world.
Without further ado, we've got a question. Someone asks, are there any Kay asks, what is happening to stop perpetrators? Is Rod aware of anything in particular happening, looking to cure, going to the root of the problem, as a kind of flip side of the stuff that you've talked about?
Good question. I'll have a look and I'll see if I can find it. Not that I'm aware of. No, it's a fairly sort of consistent issue. Again, you kind of through all the work that I've done over the last sort of 10 plus years, and I would say no. I'd be really surprised.
Interesting. Okay. And then we've had a couple of questions asking for, are you aware of any particularly strong resources that you can suggest to discuss using around internet safety or to support a conversation around it?
Yeah, and I can send you a resource list to send around to everybody after today.
Amazing. Okay.
Was the question perpetrators actually? Is that where the perpetrators are supported people?
Interesting. It doesn't specify in the question, but interesting to get your take on if that were the case.
Yeah, I mean, still the answer would be no, but obviously that's altogether more controllable and something that we should probably be looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one that's just popped in. Any tips on particularly dealing with Snapchat and revenge porn? Two big topics there, kind of in their own right, but
yeah, and again, I would say, yeah, particularly sometimes there's a tendency of people to kind of look towards, where are the big threats here? What sort of the big platforms? And so then sort of focus on things like Snapchat. I think it's a mistake to sort of focus on particular platforms, and that's because they tend to change just very, very quickly. And again, our experience in the Get Smart project was kind of, as soon as you knew about a particular platform, a particular app, younger people had tended to move on to something else that you don't know about.
Right.
I would also say to people, don't get hung up about the sort of the platforms and the apps. And again, in terms of revenge porn, I can't remember if there's anything on there. Yeah, I'm confident that there is stuff on that resource list about dealing with revenge porn. But I also think that I've probably got links to another couple of things that I can dig out for you. And again, I'm happy to send you an email, Tom, that you can circulate to people after. Would that be how this would work?
Superb. Yeah. So if you send that to me or anyone at Neurodiverse Connection, then actually we will add that to our resource library, so it has a permanent home on our website.
Yeah. There is all sorts of police advice about how to react, how to respond to revenge porn. None of which is at the top of my mind right now. But yeah, there's certainly places that I can send you.
To have a kind of curated selection, that you've gone through, because I know that a lot of the time that information can be buried away and quite inaccessible for people. So we will publish that on our website, and if you sign up to our to any of our attendees, if you signed up to our newsletter, then or follow us on Twitter, you can get notified when those resources are live on our site. That will be in the coming weeks. That is all we have time for. Thank you so much, Rod, for all of that amazing content. And
I will say it again, if people want to contact me after today, then I'm very happy to be contacted. And wonderful. You can do it via the art. Can I just drop one more thing into the chat box as well, which was that we've got a couple. We are doing a couple of workshops we've got coming up in January and February. So if people did want the more detailed content, I can just drop those into the chat box now. A couple of links.
Awesome. While you're copying those links, I'll just make out a few concluding remarks. Thank you again to our speaker, Rod, and to all of our attendees. We hope that you've enjoyed this webinar as part of the Grooming and Coercive Control Summit, and we hope to see you at some of our other talks running this afternoon and tomorrow. If you feel affected by the issues that have been discussed today, then in the Zoom chat, you'll also find a link to a curated list of support organizations compiled by Neurodiverse Connection. You'll also be able to find this on the resource library section of our website and at the bottom of the email that we sent to invite you to this webinar. It's been a pleasure hosting all of you today. We are Neurodiverse Connection. You can find us at ndconnection.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at ndconnectionuk and find us on LinkedIn, or you can do all three if you feel so disposed.
Thanks for the opportunity, Tom, Beck. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for being part of it. And thank you everyone for attending. Goodbye. Have a good rest of your afternoon.